During the billion-dollar energy project presentation, project manager Blake Harlan stood on stage accepting praise for a design that single father Reed Lawson had spent 3 years building from nothing. Reed's name had been stripped from every document, and he was kept standing in the hallway like a man who no longer belonged. When billionaire Sebastian Halstead arrived to sign the contract, Blake extended his hand with practiced confidence, but Halstead didn't sign. He studied the schematics, asked a single technical question that no one in the room could answer, and then announced quietly and without hesitation, "I only work with Reed Lawson. Stay until the end to see how Reed reclaimed everything that was taken from him and exposed the man who tried to erase his name." The morning of the final stress test, Reed Lawson arrived at the simulation facility before sunrise, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a folder of handwritten annotations he had been revising since 2 in the morning. Project Beacon had consumed 3 years of his life, not in the way most projects consumed people, through meetings and status updates and quarterly reviews, but in the specific, grinding, sleepless way that only real engineering work could demand. He had designed the load-switching algorithm from scratch, working through the mathematics of simultaneous grid disconnections across multiple facilities with the same quiet focus he'd brought to everything. He had built the testing model, trained the monitoring software, and resolved a dangerous resonance fault that the simulation team had initially written off as a calibration error. The kits spread across the workbench in front of him represented thousands of hours of calculation, failure, recalibration, and refinement, and he treated them with the careful attention of someone who understood that the machines they controlled would one day stand between a hospital's patients and a blackout. Reed was 42 years old, and he did not think of himself as exceptional. He thought of himself as thorough, and he believed thoroughness in systems that protected human lives was the only thing that truly mattered. The test was designed to simulate a winter grid failure across 3 interconnected medical facilities, and Reed ran it with the precision of someone who had already run it 47 times in his head. Beacon performed well under the first 2 load conditions, cycling off the municipal grid and redistributing power to operating rooms, life support equipment, and refrigerated medication storage without a flicker. But on the 3rd condition, the simultaneous disconnection of 3 facility zones within 90 seconds, Reed noticed something that stopped him cold. A voltage fluctuation, brief and shallow, appeared in the data stream between the 2nd and 3rd switchover. Most engineers would have logged it as acceptable variance and moved on. Reed stared at it for 11 minutes, cross-referencing it against the harmonic signature of the backup generators, and understood that under specific real-world conditions, a longer storm, a deeper grid failure, or facilities drawing higher than average load, that fluctuation could cascade into a full internal network collapse. He typed a formal request to delay the public launch by 14 days, sent it to Blake Harlan's office, and walked outside to find his daughter waiting by the chain-link fence. Avery was 17, sitting on the hood of her car, with her sketchbook open and her earbuds in, dressed in a jacket she had decorated herself with patches from every engineering conference Reed had taken her to over the years. She asked how it went, and Reed said it went fine, because the word she was really asking about, the word behind the question, was whether her father was all right, and the answer to that was also fine, at least for the moment. He did not tell her that his name no longer appeared on the project he had built. He had noticed it 2 days earlier, quietly and without confronting anyone, discovering that the document headers had been revised overnight and that the line reading Lead Systems Engineer Reed Lawson had been replaced with Project Architect Blake Harlan. He did not tell Avery because she was preparing for university applications and had enough to carry, and because he had not yet decided what to do about it. They drove home in the early morning light, and Reed thought about a voltage fluctuation and what it would mean if no one fixed it before the system went live in a real hospital. Blake Harlan had organized the launch event for the following morning with the efficiency of a man who understood that timing was everything. Sebastian Halstead and his team were flying in from Houston. The board of Argent Dynamics had cleared their schedules, and a signed contract worth $1.2 billion was waiting for the right set of hands to claim it. Blake had arranged the presentation room, the catering, the printed materials, and the press access. He had also, in the previous 72 hours, quietly directed the company's technology team to revoke Reed's access to the project servers, citing a vague administrative reorganization that would streamline the handover process. When Reed's formal delay request arrived, Blake read it once, marked it as reviewed, and filed it in a subfolder no one else could access. That evening, Blake's assistant sent Reed an email, friendly in tone, clinical in content, informing him that his role in Project Beacon had been formally concluded and that he should not report to the project facility the following morning. Reed drove to the Argent Dynamics building the next morning anyway, because he had nowhere else to go, and because something in him would not allow the system he had built to be handed off without at least one more attempt to be heard. The lobby security guard recognized him and looked briefly uncomfortable before informing him that his badge had been deactivated and that Mr. Harlan had left instructions he was not to be admitted to the upper floors. Reed stood in the atrium for a moment, watching employees he had worked beside for 3 years walk past without meeting his eye, and understood that Blake had done something thorough enough that most of them now believed whatever story they had been told. He asked the receptionist to send a message to Madeline Fairmont's office, and was told the CEO was in pre-launch preparation and not available. He asked if he could leave a written note, and was handed a slip of paper and a pen, which he used to write 6 sentences explaining the voltage fluctuation in language clear enough for a non-engineer to understand. Blake had anticipated that Reed might show up. He had prepared for it with the same methodical approach he applied to all inconveniences, by neutralizing it before it could grow. In a meeting with the project team that morning, he had presented a revised account of Reed's departure, framing it as the conclusion of a disciplinary process that had been underway for weeks. According to Blake's version, Reed had repeatedly deviated from the approved design schedule, introduced unauthorized modifications, created interpersonal conflict within the engineering group, and, most damningly, had refused to release project data when formally requested. Each accusation was constructed from something real but inverted. Reed's safety modifications became unauthorized deviations. His data backups became hoarding. His team conflicts became evidence of instability. Theo Barrett and Lila Monroe sat at that table and listened to their colleague described as a liability, and neither of them spoke because Blake had made clear, in the quiet and unambiguous way he communicated threats, that the project's success was the only thing standing between the engineering team and a round of layoffs that would begin immediately if the Halstead contract fell through. After the meeting, Blake asked each member of the team to sign a document confirming that he had served as the primary design authority for Project Beacon throughout its development. He described it as a standard administrative record. Theo signed because he had 2 children in school and a mortgage that left him no room for principal. Lila refused and was told by end of day that she was being temporarily reassigned to a compliance audit in a different division. Before she left the building, she forwarded a chain of emails to her personal account. Emails in which she had warned, repeatedly and with increasing urgency, that a set of secondary control boards had been substituted without engineering sign-off, and that their performance specifications did not meet the safety margins she had calculated. She did not tell anyone she had done it. She simply kept the folder and waited. Meanwhile, Reed stood in the hallway outside the presentation room, having been told by a junior assistant that his presence in that location was permitted for now, which meant Blake still needed him close enough to reach if Sebastian Halstead asked something technical that Blake couldn't answer. The presentation began at 10 in the morning, and Blake Harlan walked to the front of a room full of board members, investors, and journalists with the ease of a man who had rehearsed every gesture. He opened with a story about inspiration, the moment that had driven him to conceive of Project Beacon. He spoke about a hospital he had visited during a major storm, about the darkness that had fallen over a ward when the grid failed, about patients and nurses, and the desperate sound of backup generators struggling to compensate. He described how that experience had convinced him that critical infrastructure deserved a better solution, and he drew a direct line from that moment to the system that now existed. Every detail he used, the storm, the hospital, the specific image of nurses working by flashlight, belonged to a story Reed had shared with the full project team 18 months earlier during a planning session, about the night his wife Rebecca had worked through a blackout in the cardiac ward, where she was a nurse 2 years before she died. Reed heard it through the door. He stood in the hallway with his arms at his sides and listened to the story of his wife's death being used as a sales tool by a man who had never met her, and he did not make a sound. Sebastian Halstead arrived late, entering the room through a side door with a small team and taking a seat near the back without calling attention to himself. Blake did not notice him immediately, and continued into the technical section of the presentation with the glossy confidence of someone reciting lines they had memorized but not written. Sebastian opened a leather portfolio and began reading through the printed specifications without looking up. He had spent 2 years receiving technical briefings from Argent Dynamics, always through scheduled calls, always with someone identified as the project's systems lead. A calm, unhurried voice that answered questions directly, admitted uncertainty when it existed, and never once oversold the system's capabilities. Sebastian had learned, over 40 years of building and acquiring infrastructure, that the person who told him what a system could not do was always more valuable than the person who told him what it could. When Blake finished the visual presentation and opened the floor to questions, Sebastian raised his hand and asked a specific question. If 3 hospital facilities simultaneously disconnected from the municipal grid within 90 seconds, in what sequence would Beacon prioritize startup across those locations, and why? Blake answered that the system's artificial intelligence would balance the load dynamically, which was the kind of answer that sounded sophisticated to people who hadn't read the engineering documentation. Sebastian nodded and asked a follow-up. In the first load switching test, The team had identified a harmonic variance between generator sets during simultaneous disconnection. What was the measured threshold, and how had the design team resolved it? Blake stopped. The room held its breath in the particular silence that follows when a man realizes he is standing on ice he cannot cross. He glanced toward the door, and within 30 seconds his phone vibrated with a message to Reed asking for the answer. Reed read the message, set his phone face down on the chair beside him, and did not reply. Sebastian had been watching Blake's face since the second question. He closed the portfolio, placed his pen on top of it, and said, not unkindly, but with perfect clarity, that he would like to speak with Reed Lawson. Blake told him that Reed had recently concluded his role on the project due to a performance matter, and was not in a position to represent the company. Sebastian looked at him for a moment, and then said, I'm not asking him to represent the company. I'm telling you I don't sign contracts I can't discuss with the engineer who built the system. I only work with Reed Lawson. Reed was brought into the conference room by a junior communications director who had clearly been told to make this look organized. He sat across from Sebastian Halstead while the rest of the room, Blake, the board members, Madeline Fairmont, who had arrived in the last 10 minutes looking like she had missed something important, arranged themselves in the uncertain posture of people who no longer knew what role they were playing. Sebastian did not waste time on preamble. He explained that over the course of 2 years, every technical conversation he had initiated with Argent Dynamics had been routed through a systems engineer who was introduced simply as the project lead, always by first name, always on audio calls. That engineer had, at various points, told him the system was not yet ready for 3 hospital simultaneous testing, refused to guarantee a response time the board had promised, pushed back on a cost reduction proposal that would have removed the thermal isolation layer, and voluntarily disclosed a test failure rather than waiting for it to be discovered. Sebastian had built his business by learning to distinguish between people who managed information and people who understood systems, and he had understood after the third conversation that the voice on those calls was the reason Project Beacon was worth $1.2 billion. He had recognized Reed the moment Reed entered the room, not by sight, but by the way he held himself, which was the way of a man who carried information rather than performance. Sebastian laid a technical memorandum on the table, dated 26 months earlier, bearing Reed's electronic signature and the core architectural framework of the beacon system, including the load priority logic and the cascade isolation protocol. The document predated Blake's appointment as program director by 4 months. Blake said, with the diminishing conviction of someone watching evidence arrive in real time, that Reed had been executing a design that had been specified by the program leadership, that the technical implementation was separate from the conceptual architecture. Sebastian looked at him without particular hostility and said he would need to hear that claim tested against the actual design records, and turned back to Reed. Madeline asked Reed why he hadn't come forward sooner, and Reed said he had sent 3 formal notices to the program office over the preceding 6 weeks, and offered to share the delivery receipts, all of which showed the emails had been opened in Blake Harlan's account. Sebastian did not offer Reed the contract on the spot. He was a careful man, and the discrepancy between the version of the system he had been sold and the version Reed had described in the hallway, where Reed had told him quietly, before entering the room, about the voltage fluctuation in the third test, required verification before he committed. He announced that he was requesting an independent technical audit of Project Beacon's design documentation against its deployed configuration to be completed within 48 hours, and that until that audit was finished, no contract would be signed and no personnel changes would be made to the project team. The audit team arrived the following morning and spent 36 hours comparing every version of the Beacon design files against the system currently installed at the pilot facility. What they found was not a minor discrepancy. Reed's original design included 6 protective subsystems that the version Blake had taken to investors did not. A redundant load transfer buffer that prevented simultaneous generator startup, a tiered activation algorithm that sequenced facilities by patient acuity level, an isolation protocol for any hospital node that exhibited abnormal draw, an independent thermal management system for the battery storage units, a manual override procedure for periods when the network was under cyber attack, and a localized data storage module that preserved operational records even if the central server went offline. Blake's version retained all of the performance specifications from the full system, the response times, the capacity ratings, the uptime guarantees, while operating with the infrastructure required to deliver them reliably. Customers reviewing the technical summary would have had no way to know that what they were reading described a safer system than what they would actually receive. Madeline Fairmont sat in the audit debrief and felt the weight of a realization settling over her that she had been avoiding for 2 days. This was no longer a dispute about credit. A company that sold critical infrastructure with fraudulent safety specifications was liable for every failure that followed, in courtrooms, in regulatory proceedings, and, if something went wrong in an actual hospital, in consequences that no legal team could fully contain. Blake, who had sat through the first hour of the debrief with folded arms and a composed expression, began speaking when the auditors reached the component substitution records. He said the modifications had been engineering decisions made within the program's authority, and that the original specifications had been aspirational rather than final. He gestured toward Reed and said the design changes had been technically implemented by the systems team under Reed's own account credentials, and that, if the records showed unauthorized alterations, Reed was the more logical source. The audit team's report showed something Blake had not anticipated. Reed's account credentials had been used to log into the design server on 3 occasions after his physical access badge had been deactivated, which meant someone else had been using his login. Nora Bellamy, who had been quietly gathering access logs since the day after the presentation, opened her laptop and requested 5 minutes with the audit lead. Before the end of that session, the investigation had expanded beyond the design files. At the pilot hospital facility, meanwhile, a weather alert had gone active. A winter storm was moving into Denver from the northwest, and the grid load prediction service was flagging elevated demand across the city's western substations. The storm warning arrived on Reed's phone while he was sitting in a borrowed office reviewing the audit team's preliminary findings, and the number he saw in the load forecast, the rate at which the municipal grid was shedding capacity as the temperature dropped, matched almost exactly the threshold he had flagged in his delay request 3 weeks earlier. He walked down 2 floors to the operations monitoring room and found Blake already there, standing over a technician's shoulder, arguing that the alerts on the Beacon pilot system were almost certainly false positives generated by the storm's interference with the sensor network. Reed looked at the same data and saw something different. The harmonic pattern in the load fluctuation was not random. It was the same oscillation signature he had identified in the third test condition, now appearing in a live system running Blake's stripped-down configuration with a real hospital attached to it. Sebastian Halstead had remained in Denver, and when he heard that Reed had asked to be returned to operational oversight of the pilot facility, he called Madeline directly and told her that if she wanted any version of this contract to survive the next 72 hours, she needed to put Reed in the room with the controls. Blake objected loudly, saying that removing him from operational command would constitute an admission of liability. Madeline told him that was no longer her primary concern. Reed did not pause to acknowledge the reinstatement. He called Theo Barrett, whose number he still had, and Theo answered on the second ring and said he had been sitting by his phone waiting for someone to call. He called Lila Monroe, who said she would be there in 20 minutes, and arrived in 15. He gathered 3 other engineers from the grid monitoring team who had worked on the Beacon pilot installation, and within 40 minutes of the storm's first major surge, the group was operational. What they did over the next 4 hours was not dramatic in any visible sense. It was precise, methodical, and almost entirely invisible to anyone watching from outside the room. They isolated the non-essential loads from the hospital's internal network, reducing draw on the backup system by enough to prevent the cascade that Reed's models had predicted. They re-implemented the tiered activation sequence manually, writing a temporary control script that replicated the algorithm Blake had removed. They moved the hospital's critical zones, operating rooms, intensive care, the neonatal unit, the pharmacy refrigeration, onto isolated power paths that would survive even if the broader network destabilized. They documented every command they issued, every parameter they changed, and every result they observed, because Reed understood that without a clear record of what had happened and why, the events of that night would be rewritten in whatever way served the person with the most authority to write them. When the storm peaked and the municipal grid shed 17% of its capacity across Denver's western corridor, the pilot hospital did not flicker. The beacon system transferred cleanly, sequenced correctly, and held. One of Theo's engineers, reviewing the replacement components Blake had ordered 6 months earlier, found a purchase record that didn't resolve to any of the company's approved vendors. The components, secondary control boards installed in 4 of the battery management units, had been sourced from a supplier registered in Nevada under a name that a 30-second database search revealed as belonging to Blake Harlan's brother-in-law. Nora Bellamy presented her findings to the board of directors in a closed session that lasted 4 hours, and she did so with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 3 weeks building a case she intended to be irrefutable. The financial investigation had expanded well beyond the component substitution. Blake had replaced Reed's approved supplier list with a network of vendors connected, at varying degrees of remove, to entities in which he or his associates held financial interest. He had inflated procurement invoices and routed the overcharge through a consulting firm with no registered employees and no operational history. He had structured his position to receive a $25 million performance bonus upon contract signing, a figure that was contingent on the project being delivered under budget, which it was, because he had cut the safety systems that made up the difference. He had planned, after the contract was signed, to negotiate exclusive maintenance rights for the Beacon network through a separate company he controlled. ensuring that every future service call would generate revenue for him personally. He had reduced the engineering team to a size that would give them no practical ability to audit or contest his decisions, and he had used access to the company's executive server infrastructure, with the assistance of Graham Weller, the chief financial officer, to rewrite the documentary history of the project in a way that placed his name at the center and removed everyone else's. Theo Barrett gave a voluntary statement confirming that he had signed Blake's verification document under duress and that the document did not accurately describe the project's development history. He was visibly uncomfortable doing it, and Reed, who was present in the room, did not make it harder for him. He told Theo privately before the session began that the moment to speak was now, while there was still time for the truth to matter, and that he understood what it had cost him to stay quiet. Lila Monroe provided her forwarded email chain, which showed that she had raised concerns about the non-standard control boards in writing on 4 separate occasions, and that each message had been acknowledged and dismissed by Blake's office, without documentation of any engineering review. Blake, in his formal response, produced an email that appeared to show Reed requesting a personal equity stake in the project, a document that several board members found troubling, because it suggested Reed's objections were financially motivated. The email's metadata showed it had been assembled from fragments of 2 separate messages, both sent in the same week, neither of which contained the request that appeared in Blake's composite version. The board ordered a freeze on all project personnel changes and directed Nora to expand her investigation to cover the full procurement record. Blake, who had anticipated losing the room and had prepared accordingly, released the assembled email to the company's internal communication network before the session ended, along with a summary that described Reed as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated safety concerns after being denied financial compensation. By the following morning, a version of that narrative had reached several people who knew Reed only as a name on an org chart, and a smaller number who knew him well enough to be troubled by it. Avery saw it on her phone during a lunch break at school, sent to her by a friend who had found it on an industry gossip site, and she called her father immediately. Reed answered and listened and told her, with a steadiness he was working to maintain, that the document had been constructed from pieces of real messages and that the meaning attributed to them was not accurate. Avery asked what he was going to do about it, and Reed said he was going to focus on making sure the system was safe, and then he was going to prove what actually happened. She asked if he needed help, and he said she should focus on her applications. After they hung up, Reed sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and thought about the fact that his daughter had just had to read a public document describing her father as a man who had threatened to sabotage critical infrastructure for personal gain, and he decided that whatever the outcome of the board investigation, he would not stop until the record was complete. Thomas Kincaid formally asked Reed to step back from any active role in the project until the investigation concluded, framing it as a neutral administrative measure that protected all parties. Sebastian Halstead, who was still in Denver, called Madeline Fairmont and told her he was watching her decision-making with considerable interest, and that if she permitted the man who had saved a live hospital installation during an active storm to be sidelined while his accuser remained in the building, he would consider that evidence about the kind of company he was being asked to partner with. Madeline made no immediate announcement, but she authorized Nora to request the login metadata from the executive server. The metadata told a story that had nowhere to hide. The executive server, the one Graham Weller had administrative access to, showed a sequence of login events spanning 11 nights over 3 months, during which the project's document history had been systematically rewritten. Author fields had been changed, version timestamps had been adjusted, and access logs for Reed's account had been fabricated to show him making edits during periods when his physical badge records showed him in a different building or off campus entirely. Graham Weller's own credentials appeared in the access log for 7 of those 11 sessions. He had not attempted to cover that, perhaps because he had not anticipated that anyone would look at a server that was technically outside the scope of the project audit. Madeline called Graham into her office before the board reconvened and asked him 2 questions, directly and without preamble. He answered neither of them. He asked instead to speak with outside counsel, which she considered sufficient. She then called Sebastian Halstead and told him the investigation had identified coordination between Blake Harlan and the company's chief financial officer in the falsification of project records, and that she was formally suspending both individuals pending the outcome of a full forensic audit. Sebastian listened, thanked her, and said he would need an additional 72 hours before any contract discussion could resume. Madeline agreed and then sat alone in her office for a long time, thinking about all of the things she had decided not to look at when looking at them would have been inconvenient. Reed had asked, throughout the investigation, that the inquiry not narrow itself to individual misconduct. He had submitted a formal memo to the board, requesting a structural review of the policies that had allowed a program director to unilaterally revise authorship records, freeze engineering staff out of a live system, and redirect procurement to undisclosed affiliates without triggering any automatic oversight mechanism. The memo was 2 pages long and written in the same spare, direct language as everything else Reed produced. It did not assign blame beyond what the evidence already showed. It asked, instead, for an accounting of the system that had made all of this possible, and for changes that would make it harder next time. Blake, who had been losing ground for 72 hours and understood it, made his final move by announcing to the investors still in Denver that he was prepared to demonstrate his comprehensive understanding of the beacon system in a live technical evaluation at the pilot facility, and that he challenged Reed to participate in the same evaluation simultaneously, so the board could determine for themselves who had actually designed what they were looking at. Reed accepted without discussion. Sebastian Halstead designed the evaluation himself, and he did it the way he had made every important decision in his career, by creating conditions that could not be prepared for in advance. He informed both participants of the scenario 60 seconds before it began. A secondary battery bank was taken offline. 2 simulated hospital nodes were disconnected from the grid simultaneously. The central communications relay was throttled to 20% of its normal capacity. A thermal alert was triggered in one of the generator enclosures, and the load conditions were set to a pattern that did not match any of the historical data either participant had reviewed during the audit. Blake Harlan had spent the preceding 12 hours reviewing documentation and had asked 3 engineers to brief him on the system's operational logic. He stood in front of the control interface with the concentrated expression of someone who had memorized a map of territory he had never walked. When the scenario activated, he spent 40 seconds reading through alert screens, then issued a command to bring all backup generation online simultaneously, a decision that, in the actual system, would have caused a voltage surge sufficient to trip the hospital's internal circuit protection and black out the wards he was attempting to power. Reed stepped forward calmly before the command executed and said one sentence, "That will collapse the internal network." Blake told him to stay out of it. Reed looked at the lead auditor, who nodded, and Reed said it again, clearly enough for the room to hear. The auditor suspended the command. Reed took the seat in front of the interface and narrated each step as he performed it, isolating the faulted battery bank from the active load path, redirecting essential circuits through the secondary transfer switch, initiating the tiered generator sequence starting with the smallest stable units to prevent harmonic interference, enabling a power-sharing protocol between the two hospital nodes that distributed the deficit without dropping either, reserving the remaining battery capacity exclusively for the ventilators and surgical lighting, and then, once the network had stabilized, gradually restoring full generator output without creating the oscillation the storm test had originally exposed. He described every decision as he made it, not for performance, but because he had spent 3 years building a system that he needed other people to understand. The pilot facilities monitoring board showed green across every critical ward. The evaluation was over in under 18 minutes. Sebastian turned to the room and said what everyone already understood but needed to hear stated plainly. A person could steal slides, change document headers, and put their own name on a design. They could not steal the comprehension of the person who had built it. Before the session formally closed, Blake moved toward the operations terminal and attempted to open the data export function, an action Nora had anticipated, and for which she had already prepared a full server-side audit trail that would capture every keystroke made on that terminal for the duration of the evaluation. Nora Bellamy's final evidentiary presentation lasted 2 hours. She covered the original document history extracted from backup servers that Blake had not known existed, the transcript record of every technical call Reed had participated in during the project's development, the assembled email Blake had constructed, and the source messages it had been drawn from. The procurement trail connecting the non-standard control boards to Blake's family member's company. The executive server access logs showing Graham Weller's direct involvement. The safety alerts Lila Monroe had submitted and their subsequent disappearance from the formal record. And the complete log of the operations terminal during the live evaluation, including Blake's attempted data export. She presented it without commentary beyond what was necessary to explain each document, and the board received it in a silence that had the specific quality of people absorbing something they would have preferred not to know. Blake Harlan and Graham Weller were suspended with immediate effect, escorted from the building before the session ended, and referred to the company's outside legal counsel for review of potential criminal liability under statutes covering financial fraud, document falsification, and corporate misconduct. The forensic audit was expanded to cover the full 3-year project period. Madeline Fairmont addressed the board directly and acknowledged that she had constructed a management structure in which the people responsible for building critical systems had fewer channels of meaningful recourse than the people responsible for administering them, and that this had made everything Blake had done easier than it should have been. She did not resign. She stayed and accepted the board's instruction to implement the structural recommendations Reed had submitted in his memo. Sebastian Halstead signed the contract for $1.2 billion. He did it in a room with Reed, Theo, Leela, and 4 other members of the original engineering team, and he made 3 requests before the pen touched the paper. He asked that the full Project Beacon technical team be formally credited as the system's designers in every public and contractual document going forward. He asked that the safety subsystems Reed had originally specified be fully restored in every deployed installation, at whatever cost. And he asked that Reed Lawson hold technical approval authority over every future modification to the beacon architecture, not as a formality but as a condition of the contract. Reed accepted the role of technical director. He declined the executive title that Madeline offered alongside it, saying he was an engineer and that adding a different word to his badge would not change what he was. He asked instead for one specific condition of his own, that Theo and Lila stand beside him at the formal signing, because their names had been removed from the design they had contributed to, and he was not prepared to accept credit for a collaborative effort as if it were a solo one. Madeline agreed. The photograph taken that afternoon showed 5 people at a conference table, none of whom was looking at the camera, because they were all looking at the document they had just made official. A year after the signing, the first 12 beacon installations were operational across hospitals and regional airports in 7 states. Each control room contained a small plaque mounted near the monitoring station, no larger than a standard sheet of paper, listing the full names of the design team. From Reed Lawson at the top to the 2 technicians who had conducted the battery calibration tests in the final month before launch. The plaques had been Reed's request, and Sebastian had included their manufacture and installation as a line item in the contract at Reed's suggestion. Reed kept the same schedule he had kept for 11 years. In the facility by 6:30 in the morning, out by 5 in the evening, home in time to eat dinner at the table he had eaten at every night since Rebecca died. Avery had been accepted to an engineering design program, and she spent her last summer at home teaching herself parametric drafting software on the same kitchen table where Reed had done his calculations for years. She appeared one last time in the public record that year at the announcement of a technical scholarship established in Rebecca Lawson's name, awarded annually to a nursing or engineering student working on healthcare infrastructure. Avery sat in the front row and did not speak, because her father had asked her not to, because he believed the scholarship should be about her mother and not about the story that had led to it. Madeline Fairmont changed 5 policies in the 18 months following the investigation. Document authorship could no longer be modified by a single user without a 2-person verification process. Engineers held a direct reporting channel to the board's safety committee that bypassed program management. Performance bonuses across all divisions were decoupled from revenue figures and tied instead to quality and safety metrics verified by independent review. Project team members were listed by name in all public disclosures related to their work, and no manager at any level was permitted to accept sole credit for work attributed to a team in any internal or external communication without that team's counter-signature. None of these changes were dramatic. All of them were necessary. At a ceremony marking the 1-year anniversary of the Halstead contract, Sebastian found Reed standing in front of a wall-mounted diagram of the beacon network. Not the simplified version used in investor materials, but the full system architecture, with every node and every connection, labeled in the small, precise handwriting that had appeared in technical documents throughout the project's history. Sebastian asked him why he had never pushed to have his name appear more prominently in the public materials that had been released over the past year. Reed looked at the diagram for a moment and said that Project Beacon had never been built by one person, and that he didn't think a name that appeared largest on a document was the most accurate measure of who had made something real. Sebastian smiled at that, the way a man smiles when someone says something he has believed for a long time and rarely heard confirmed aloud, and said it was exactly why he had only wanted to work with him. Madeline called Reed 2 weeks later and suggested dinner after Avery left for school in the fall. Not a business meeting, she said, and with a directness that surprised neither of them. Reed said he would think about it, which meant he would, and that he would let her know, which he did. The conversation that followed was brief and personal and entirely separate from everything that had come before. 3 years earlier, Blake Harlan had stood in a presentation room and believed that erasing a name from a document was sufficient to erase the person who had written everything beneath it. He had not understood, could not have understood, because he had never built anything, that the system Reed had designed was not stored in a file or a slide or a project record. It lived in every safety decision that had survived the budget cuts, every failure mode that had been anticipated and addressed before it became a crisis. Every engineer who had been shown how to think about a problem rather than simply told what to do. When the storm moved through Denver and the city's western grid went dark, and the hospital windows stayed lit, the light was not Blake's. It had never been Blake's. Every building that remained powered in a blackout, every patient whose monitors kept running, every ward that stayed warm through the night, all of it bore the unmistakable mark of a man whose name, whatever had been done to it on paper, was written permanently into the work itself.